Stanford University.
Welcome to the seminar on People, Computers, and Design. I'm Terry Winograd. To take it simple this week, this announcements. Next week, we have another talk from a psychologist, so it's 2 in a row. That'll be very helpful. Barbara Tversky, who has a position here at Stanford, also teaches at Columbia in New York City, and has done a lot of work with people doing HCI over the years. And in particular, her current interests are how people perceive events. And so looking even at things like comic books, what is the event structure that is represented in any kind of an interface? So next week is Barbara Tversky on perception of events. This week, we're perceiving color. So Steve Palmer is a psychologist from UC Berkeley who has done a lot of work, written a very extensive book on psychology of vision, and has been interested for the past few years in particular psychology of color vision. So this is not about how do the various rods and cones react specifically, but what role does that play in people's lives, how they perceive and what they do with it, including the aesthetic side of it, which is something that people in interaction design always worry about but don't have much scientific information to go on. So he's filling in that gap, and today he will talk about it.
Great. Well, thank you, Terry. I'm pleased to be here. I want to tell you today about part of a research program that I only began about 3 years ago that's generally about what I call aesthetic science, and the idea is to try to do an aesthetic, try to understand human aesthetic response from a scientific as opposed to an artistic or art historical perspective. I got into this in part because I'm a photographer, and you'll see in a minute how that sort of led me into this particular field. So overall, my plan here is just to say make a few remarks about aesthetic science. I think there should be such a thing as aesthetic science. Then I'm going to talk about people's preferences for individual colors. I'm going to talk about this theory that we have about why it is that people have the color preferences that they do. And then move in to talk about preferences for combinations of colors, color composition. Of course, I'm only going to get to pairs of colors. And then I'm going to talk about some notion I'm going to call aesthetic personality, which we think that we may have some kind of a handle on. So first of all, this notion of aesthetic science, I'm going to skip the stuff with the dictionary definitions and all that kind of thing, and just say, I'm a photographer. This is one of my photographs. It's been, messed with in Photoshop using the watercolor filter. But the important thing is that I really like it, and actually a lot of people really like it, and some people have paid actually a fair amount of money for that particular thing. And the question that I became interested in is, well, why is it that people like this picture? Not this one in particular, but pictures in general. Why do they like the ones they like? Is it something about the spatial composition of the photograph, or the colors that it's made of, or maybe something about the color combinations, or the textures that got added by the watercolor filter? Well, it's probably all of these things. In fact, though, I'm just going to talk about 2 things today, the color-related parts of this. I should say I've got another whole hour-long colloquium that I could give about spatial composition, because that's the other sort of main thing that I'm doing aesthetically, but that's another topic for another time. So the question here is, what colors do people like, and why do they like them? And I believe that it is important. This is the part where I'm not going to go off and show you all the examples, but I think that our visual culture, if you want to call it that, in a lot of areas is not terribly aesthetically pleasing, and one of them is on the internet. I have to say, when I gave the talk at Google, I went to find some aesthetically pleasing websites, and I went to the ones that had won awards and stuff like that, and they had things that got bigger and smaller and sped across the screen and whirled around and did stuff, but none of them were pleasing. They were kind of eye-catching, but they weren't aesthetically pleasing to me or the people who work with me in any case. So I think it's an area in which a lot could be done, and I think actually a lot could be done particularly because as you'll see, there's huge individual differences in people's aesthetic preferences. There's a lot that can be done to make things aesthetically pleasing in a customizable way. You just have to get some information from people about what colors they like, what kinds of combinations, and so forth. And that gets into the sort of end of the talk where I talk about aesthetic personality. All right, so one of the things that I want to get off right at the beginning is off of the table here is, well, aesthetic science is impossible. I don't know whether there's anybody here who sort of feels like this, but some people would say, oh, science is objective and aesthetics is subjective, and science is lawful and aesthetics is whimsical, and we've got sayings like there's no accounting for taste or beauty's in the mind of the beholder, and all this stuff sort of seems to imply that, well, you really can't do a science of aesthetics. And in a sense, I want to convince you that that's wrong-headed, and by demonstration, I want to show you that it's not only possible, but it's interesting and it's fun. There are at least 3 important goals of this interdisciplinary aesthetic science that I hope eventually will happen. One of them is what's sort of already around a lot, and that's sort of normative aesthetics. This is where people follow a prescriptive approach. That is, artists and art historians and art critics say what they think you should like. But then there's a sort of more scientific question you can ask, which is, what do people actually like? And a sort of theoretical question, which is why? Why do they like them? And this is something there's very little work on. But that's going to be the focus of this talk, actually, is going to be on the empirical stuff, the results, what colors do people like, and why do they like them? And we actually have something to say about that, I think. So, preferences for individual colors. Everything I'm going to tell you about is part of a big project called the Berkeley Color Project, which I have been doing with Karen Schloss. It's what we call a massive repeated measures design, which people in psychology don't do very much. What this means is you bring in a lot of people. For me, a lot of people means 50. And you have them do about 30 different tasks, all on the same set of 37 colors. And this gives you a lot of leverage because the data you get from, in any domain, I think, where there's big individual differences, this is important because then it gives you some leverage in which you can use some of your data to explain some of your other data. And you'll see examples of that as I go through. So here are some of the tasks that we've used. We get single color preferences, which I'm going to talk about, not just for a colored square on a screen, but asking them actually about those colored squares on the screen. How much would you like this color if it was the color of a t-shirt? How much would you like it if it were a color of the walls in your living room? And so forth. We get basically color appearance measures, how red versus green is this color, how light versus dark, how warm versus cool, and so forth. And we also get emotional associations. How happy is this color? How lively is this color? How dreary is this color? And so forth. I don't think I'm going to have time to tell you about the music stuff, but we did actually have people pick out colors that went best with a bunch of different selections of classical orchestral music, and we got some really beautiful data about that, but I don't think I'm going to have time for that. And we also got a lot of data on color pairs, combinations of colors, how much they like color pairs, how harmonious various color combinations are, I will talk about this, and how similar those colors are. And we also got some personality measures. So, sort of shotgun, we did lots and lots of stuff, all of which we were hoping would be related to each other. We had 48 subjects. It was an unusual group because it was diverse both ethnically and in terms of age and people's careers. So it wasn't just all undergraduates. We had professional artists, we had graphic designers, we had interior decorators, and so forth, as well as the usual complement of students. So we divided people into sort of high and low expertise in terms of color, and we had equal numbers of males and females. So we basically had 12 people in each of this cell of the design. Generally speaking, the way we do these experiments, we show people a colored square on a gray background, and we ask them to make a rating along a line mark scale from one dimension from one end to another. We find that if they use the sliders, they don't remember what they did before in the same way they do if they use numbers. And we'd ask them in one set of tasks, how much do you like this color? How warm versus cool is it? How active versus passive is the color? And so forth. Lots of different things, like 30 different tasks. And we picked 37 colors, and here's how we did it. To sort of understand the rationale, you have to know something about color science. A color space is a representation of color experiences in which each color experience corresponds to a point in the space, a dimensional space, and it turns out you can do a very good job of modeling color appearance within a three-dimensional space. And the classical sort of high-level perceptual dimensions of this are hue, which you might call the basic color, composed of a red, green, and a blue, yellow dimension. Also a dimension of saturation, which goes from grays along the central core of the color space out to the highly saturated vivid colors on the outside, and then brightness, which goes from black at the bottom to white at the top. Okay? So here's how we picked our colors. We picked 8 different hues, including the 4 unique hues. In color science, there are 4 pure colors. There's a unique red, green, blue, and yellow. We picked those. And we picked the angle bisectors of those. So orange, purple, cyan, and chartreuse. Okay, orange and purple, you all know what that means. Probably everyone knows what cyan is. It's a blue-green color. It's that one in the sort of upper left quadrant. And chartreuse is the one, although it looks a great deal like green here. Yeah, I can't, this is actually not a bad projector, but, all bets are off when you're not actually doing it on a calibrated monitor. We did all our stuff on calibrated monitors. So chartreuse is the one sort of the upper right, yellow greens. And we picked then each of those 8 hues at 4 different what we call cuts through the color space. So there's each of those colors in its light version, in its saturated version, in its muted version, and its dark version. And we started with the saturated ones, and then we just sort of picked the color that was halfway from the saturated colors to white, and we called those are the light colors. And from the saturated colors down to black, halfway, those were the dark colors. And the muted colors were halfway from the saturated colors to the central axis. Yeah?
So HSP isn't the perceptually uniform space. Does that get you into trouble, or does that not matter here?
In some cases, it probably does matter whether it gets us into it does matter whether it gets us into trouble or is actually a good thing. When you look at the research that's done by the people who really worry about that stuff and get very anal about making sure that everything is like, perceptually uniform, it turns out, I think I have a slide in here that shows you, I do. I'll come back to that. And we have the 5 grays, okay, along the center. So these are our 37 colors shown in a slightly different way. And this is their representation in CIE-LIB space. And just to follow up on that question, so one of the things that we were able to do by selecting our colors in this particular way is we were able to include highly saturated versions of the unique hues and highly nameable colors and so forth. People who tried these are real color scientists, unlike me, who worry about making sure that they've controlled everything, so that they're equally bright and da-da-da-da-da. They came up with this set of colors. Well, I don't know about you, but, that leaves out an awful lot of important stuff. So there are places, for example, where it matters. The cool colors are actually more similar to each other than the warm colors are. So we find some effects relative to that, but we have other data that we've collected so that we can scale things according to their perceived similarity because we get all those measurements from our subjects. Okay, so what do the data look like? So we've got these, I'm only going to be talking about the chromatic colors today. The grays are kind of problematic, but let's look first at the data from the light colors and the muted colors because they're virtually identical. Okay, we've got a broad peak in the cool colors around cyan, blue, and purple, with the most preferred color being blue. And then there's this narrow trough around chartreuse. There's this sort of local maximum or bump around yellow. I'll come back to that later. I think that's actually a Berkeley artifact. But and when you look at the saturated colors, basically things look pretty much the same, except people like the saturated colors better. The difference comes in the dark colors. There we get very different stuff from we get. So you can, the first three cuts, you can describe, well, there's a peak at blue, and there's a sharp valley at chartreuse. Maybe there's a general valley around the warm colors relative to the cool colors, but things are very different for the dark colors. For the dark colors, people really don't like dark yellow, which is essentially olive. They don't like dark orange, which is essentially brown. They do like dark green, and they do like dark red. I'm doing this relative to the sort of muted and light colors. So what's up with this? What might this be about? Well, you can tell an interesting just so story. People like blue because it's the color of clear skies and clean water, and they like dark green because it's the color of healthy vegetation, and they like red because it's the color of ripe fruit and berries, and they don't like brown because it's the color of biological waste products, and they don't like olive because it's also, I mean, brown and olive, this is the color that also rotten food comes in those particular shades. Yeah.
Is there also any control for what colors are more common, what colors do we see more often in everyday life as opposed to what?
Well, yeah, we haven't done that. That's a good question. Let me go through, because I'm going to have a lot to say about this particular story. I used to tell it as, okay, the ha ha ha. And then at some point I decided I had to take it seriously, and we did. This is a truth in advertising slide. This is what individual data look like relative to the signal that I just showed you, and everything I'm going to be talking about today pretty much is about average color preferences. There's huge individual variation. It doesn't seem to be terribly systematic in any obvious way, although I think there are systematicities that underlie it, and I think there are ways of studying it, and I'll come back to that. So what about, oh, this is just to show that actually it's not only the average that seems to follow this basic curve, that is, you like cool colors better than warm colors. The people who like each of the colors, the ones who like the blues like it better than the people who like the yellows like yellow, and similarly for the least liked colors. Okay. So what about object differences? What happens here? Let's first look at, just worry about people's hue preferences, not worry about the brightness and saturation differences. And what we find is that basically the shape of these curves is all pretty much the same. If you like blue, you like blue couches, and you like blue t-shirts, and you like blue da-da-da-da-da-da. At least on average this is generally true, except for big red things. I'm not exactly sure why this is. There is something special and different about red, I'm convinced by this point. There's lots and lots of different ways that you can show that this is the case. But basically people don't want walls or trim or couches that are red, particularly, at least in this sort of normative sense.
How were the choices presented as actual objects or just verbally?
Just verbally. We actually are now collecting data. Okay, we're now comparing people's choices where they say, how much would you like this as the color of a t-shirt, where they get a square of it, versus a picture of a t-shirt that's that color. I'm not exactly sure that we're going to go all the way to having all the t-shirts, 37 t-shirts, even if we could make them, that were color calibrated and stuff like that. But the, what?
Photoshop.
Well, no, Photoshop on the pictures. I'm talking about the real t-shirts. I don't know how quite to do that. Yeah, we're doing the Photoshop experiment now, actually. But there are big differences here, according to objects, but they're almost all in saturation and brightness. So if you look at just the squares on the screens, it's either a small square or it's the whole screen. There, it doesn't matter how bright it is, people really like it if it's saturated, right? But for all the rest of the stuff, people hate it if it's saturated. So if you look at the interior room surfaces, here are the data for the saturated colors. They hate them. And here there's a general trend toward liking lighter ones because I guess it's, more reflective surfaces. It's cheerier or something. Clothes, there tends to be a trend toward liking the darker colors better. They still don't like the saturated colors, but it's okay for a t-shirt or a tie, not so much for a dress or a whole shirt. And that may be the large red thing too. And room furnishings, they really, really, really don't like saturated couches, for example. Okay? What about gender differences? Well, if you look overall at hue preferences for men versus women, there's no difference. But if you break it down by these different cuts, what you find is that men prefer saturated colors to muted colors, and by and large, women tend to like muted colors more than saturated colors. Now, this was kind of a surprise to me, because you look at what people wear, and by and large, women wear the more saturated colors, and the men wear the more muted colors. But then you start thinking, oh, well, who are they dressing for? So I think that this may be part of what's going on, that the guys like saturated colors, so the women wear them, and vice versa. And interestingly, if you take the different scores between the men's and the women's scores for all 37 colors, it turns out it correlates very highly with these ratings of how active versus passive the colors are. So there's a case, for example, where by getting all of these different measurements on the same people, we can actually find out to what extent this difference between the colors that men and women like is related to any of these other ratings that they made. And it turns out it's very closely related to active versus passive and not very much with other stuff. So that's interesting. Expertise differences. And we didn't know what to expect here. And what we found out was kind of, again, a little bit surprising to me. The first part wasn't so much. That if you look at the very first session where they did their color preferences, the sophisticated people, that is to say the artists and the designers and so forth, like chromatic colors better than I'll just call them the naive subjects. It's not that they're using the scale differently, because if you look at the grays and black and white, they're the same. But the chromatic colors, the color sophisticated people like better than the naive people in session 1. We ran everybody through all these tests, and then we did, at the very end, we also did the very same test that we did in session 1. And there, it, if anything, reverses. So what has happened during the course of doing all of these tasks about colors is that the color sophisticated people, I think, got kind of bored with it, and they ended up liking the colors less, whereas the color naive people, in fact, liked the colors a bit more than they did before. And so their relative positions have changed. What about cultural differences? Everybody wants to know about cultural differences. Well, we've started actually to look at cultural differences. So those are the data that I showed you before, the hue preferences by the 4 different cuts. And we've now repeated this experiment in Japan. Japan was of interest in part because I was told by one of the graphic designers that they'd done work in Japan, and Japanese like pastel colors. They like light colors. So he said. And in fact, they do. We did it. That's one of the big differences between the Japanese and American preferences. Now you can see that there's also commonalities. This kind of wave where they like the cool colors better than the warm colors seems to be true in both cultures. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why the next set of data we want to get are from Mexico and also from India, because in Mexico and India, if you look at folk art and the way that people dress and things like that, saturated colors, and particularly warm saturated colors, seem to be prominent. So I'm wondering whether that's going to translate into different preferences there that would the function even go the other way around. We don't know. So they like light colors more than we do, and they like dark colors less than we do, particularly dark red. I mean, Americans like dark red and the Japanese don't, and I don't know what that's about. You'd think with their flag, with a big red circle in the middle of a white field, that red would be a color they would like, but apparently not. And again, we're going to come back to this later, because the ecological valence theory has something to say about how you might predict differences across cultures. So these are basically the data that I've showed you. Overcuts, what does the hue preference function look like for our Berkeley Color Project adults? Looks like that. That's this sort of wave thing. Just to remind you what this really means, because hue is a circular dimension, okay, it folds back on itself. What it really means is that there's a huge difference in aesthetic preference between blues and yellows, and not much of a difference between reds and greens. When you average across subjects, that's not to say that individuals are like this, but when you average across a fair number of representative people. Interestingly, it turns out You get the same sort of warm-cool kind of difference in infants when you measure their preference by looking preferences. So what you do with babies is you sit them in front of 2 squares of color on a display of some sort, and you measure how much time they spend looking at each of the 2 colors. Or sometimes they'll look at which one they look at first. Not entirely clear this is exactly the same as the preferences that we're measuring, because this might be something about just visual contrast. It like captures their attention or something. But you get basically the same kind of preference function. These are 12-week-old infants. The problem with doing it with younger infants is that their color vision system is not yet fully developed. Their S cones are not fully operative. They're sort of operating like red-green colorblind adults are. By 12 weeks, though, they seem to be pretty much trichromatic like adults. And another interesting fact is that if you look at macaque monkeys, whose visual systems are basically identical to human color vision system, you find a very different pattern. It seems that it's monotonically increasing from the reds to the blues. Don't know what to make of that. We're actually going to start getting data from infants and from monkeys on all 37 of our colors, so we can track more clearly what the, I'm going to call them species differences. Of course, 12-week infants are not exactly a different species, but close. All right, so those are some basic facts that we've established about people's color preferences for individual colors. Now I want to talk about why might they have these colors preferences. And it's not something that anybody has had much to say about, surprisingly. So these are sort of the theories I'm going to talk about. They're kind of the only theories I know of that are sort of around. One of them is a cone contrast theory. And this is a theory by some very sort of rigorous color scientists who think that they can account for people's color preferences just by virtue of these bipolar cells that we know exist even in the retina that code the difference between the short and the long wavelength, the medium and the long wavelength cones, and the short versus the medium and long wavelength cones. I'll get to that in a second. There's another theory that's called the color emotion theory, which is that when you look at colors, it creates in you certain sort of, or at least has emotional associations. And the idea is that, well, if you look at colors that make you feel good, then you should like those colors. That's the basic idea. And I should say they did a lot of research here, and they claim that you can sort of dimensionally compress all these emotional things into these 3 dimensions, which is active versus passive, cool versus warm, and light versus heavy. And that the ones that people like are the active colors, the cool colors, and the light colors. It's kind of interesting because the cool colors are the ones that people judge to be least happy. So it's not entirely clear quite how this works, but we're going to take their word for it that they think you can do it this way. The third theory I'm going to call a color appearance theory. And this was really what I was hoping when I went into this project would work. You know, I'm sort of taking a psychophysical approach to this. I wanted high-level perceptual experiences of colors to be the things that mattered. So here the idea is that you can take things in terms of red versus green, blue versus yellow, light versus dark, and saturation, high versus low saturation. But that doesn't say why. It just sort of says that you like these colors. And the fourth one is the ecological valence theory, which I'm going to describe to you now. So in a way, it's a kind of integration of this sort of an evolutionary and an emotional approach. And the easiest way to explain it to you is in terms of an analogy with food preferences. Okay? So preference with colors is like preferences with food in an evolutionary or an adaptive way. And what that means is you can make a pretty good argument that an organism is likely to have evolutionary success, that is to say, survive and reproduce, if they're attracted to good tasting stuff and they're repelled by bad tasting stuff. And that's going to work as long as the stuff that tastes good is the stuff that tends to be nutritious, the sweet stuff, the fatty stuff, and so forth. And the things that don't taste good, the bitter stuff, the sour stuff, is likely to be noxious or even poisonous. That's a good heuristic, right? As long as your taste, let's call it your aesthetic taste preference, is lined up in this way, it's going to be adaptive for you to eat the stuff that tastes good and not eat the stuff that tastes bad. Okay? So you just sort of replace that with the good tasting and bad tasting with good looking stuff, where in this case, good looking stuff means stuff that's the colors you like. So this is where the just so story comes in. What colors do we like? Well, we like saturated blues like the sky. We like dark greens like healthy vegetation. We like dark reds like berries and fruit and so forth. And we don't like the stuff that's the colors of poop and vomit and so forth. I should say that I'm presenting this as though it's a pure evolutionary story in a genetic sense. There may be some genetic component to it, but certainly this ecological valence theory does not preclude. In fact, it invites the possibility that there are big effects that happen during people's lifetimes. You have experiences with objects. Some of them are positive, some of them are negative. You tend to like the colors that are the colors of things with which you've had positive experiences, and you tend not to like the things that you've had experiences with that are negative. That's the sort of essence of this theory. So we modeled these, we tested these three models in terms of our data by doing multiple regression analyses, and we never really had to use more than three components for the four theories that I just talked about. So one of them is the cone contrast theory, and it turns out you can only account for 34% of the variance with that model. And here we're just using the dimensions of these cone contrast spaces. That is, the short minus the medium plus long wavelengths is one. The sum of all three of them, that's the overall brightness, that's another one. The L minus M, that's sort of the red-green component approximately. If you do it in terms of color emotions, these three dimensions that the color emotion theorists have identified, which is active versus passive, cool versus warm, and light versus heavy, you do much better, 55% of the variance. Still not great, but significantly better than the cone contrast. If you do it with color appearances, that is our own data's ratings of how red versus green and blue versus yellow, notice red-green doesn't do anything in this model. It's all blue-yellow, saturation, and brightness. A little bit better, not much better. And the ecological valence theory, how in the world are you going to test that theory? So we came up with a way. Before I explain it, I just want to show you just how bad these models are. So here's our data, right? Those are the actual data we're trying to predict. Here are the best predictions from the multiple regression equations for the cone contrast theory. Don't look too much like the data, do they? There's the best predictions of the emotion theory, and there's the best predictions of the color appearances theory. Now, notice what's going on with the color appearances theory, which is the best of the bunch. It gets the overall shape of warm versus cool. They like the cool colors better than the warm colors. It gets the fact that the light and muted are the same and that people like the saturated colors better. Where it falls down is with the dark colors. All right, so, and that's true for all of these things. And it's going to be true for almost any color appearance type model because of the structure of human color vision. That just seems to be, it's not going to be able to account for that kind of difference. So how would we go about testing our just so story? I don't need to remind you what it is. We do this very complicated thing which we call the wave experiment, in which we, this is a different wave than the warm-cool wave. This is the weighted affective valence estimate wave, which I'll explain in a second. There's 4 different phases to it. It's very complicated. And it's essentially a measurement procedure for testing the theory. First, we have one group of subjects. I've already told you about that. They make these ratings, how much they like the colors. We have another group that comes in, and they see the same set of colors, only they write down descriptions of all the objects that they can think of that are that color, approximately. Then we have another bunch of subjects come in, and we show them the descriptions in just black and white text. How much do you like tropical oceans? And we give them this rating scale, I like it a lot, to I don't like it at all. How much do you like baby poo? How much do you like, there's gross stuff in there, all the things that our undergraduates told us. And then the fourth group then gets both the color and the description, and they're making a rating of, well, how similar is the color of these things to this color on the screen? Because we want to sort of weight things by whether it's really sort of central or whether this is kind of like not really very similar. Well, you know, what would be a good, a blue for this? I mean, a blueberry, okay? You might say a blueberry because it's blue, but it's not really very similar to a blueberry. So that number for these group would be very small weighting. So the data look like this. We call it the WAVE, the Weighted Affective Valence Estimate. You get a color like this, and then you have a list of all the objects that people have named as being associated with this color in their minds. And we've got then the valence that the second group made of how much they like this kind of object. So blues, by and large, are pretty positive. They like it, particularly like clear blue sky and clean water and so forth. What's not so great here? Sea foam is not so great. But there's actually no negative numbers. These numbers range from, I think, plus 200 to minus 200. Then we also have these match scores. How well does the color in the object, well, how much does the color match the color of the object? These have been scaled to be between 0 and 1. And then we just multiply those things together and we add them up and divide by n. So the average, we're getting the average of these weighted affective valence estimates, and we do this for each of the 37 colors. Complicated, but you can see how it's related to the theory. The theory says you like the colors that are the colors of objects that you like. So we find out how much people like the colors, we find out how much people like the objects, we find out how similar the colors are to the objects, and we weight that, and then we just take the average across all 37 colors, and what do we find out? Well, this is what I showed you for the other 3 models, how well it does, and this is how well the WAVE does. Okay, and this is a single number. It's a complicated number because you have to do a lot of experimental stuff to get it, but there's actually no free variables here. You have one predictor, you've got one predicted variable, you can account for 80% of the variance, so it's a correlation of essentially 0.9. And what do the actual data look like? Well, those are our empirical data, and these are the actual values of the WAVE. And notice what it does is, unlike any of the others, it has this interaction between the dark colors and the rest of the colors. It shows that the reason, well, and it provides an explanation of why people like the colors they do, because they like the objects that are that color. And they may like those other objects for all kinds of different reasons. But we actually don't include in the WAVE any objects that could be any color. So if somebody says, this color looks like the color of my t-shirt, we don't include that. Because first of all, nobody knows what color your t-shirt is. And because people are going to have to make their judgments based on this description that just says my t-shirt. Other people have to know what color it is, and it has to be something that has a sort of natural color or a small set of colors. So actually, this is out of date. It's actually, so 0.9, the correlation is 0.9, and it's 80% of the variance. And it's better than the other models, and it gives you an actual causal explanation. It's based on a correlation, so of course there's always the question of which way does the correlation go. Maybe people like blue sky because they like blue. And maybe people don't like feces because it's brown. But then you have problems explaining why does it people like chocolate. Okay, so that's just a particularly poignant example where there seems to be a big difference between people's affective values. And the idea is that, well, how much you like brown is really an average over lots of really negative stuff. Chocolate is kind of an outlier. And depending on whether you grew up in a farm or not, dirt may be an outlier. Some people like dirt, some people don't. So we can really do a pretty darn good job, and it's a very different kind of explanation from any of the others. What are the implications? I said there are cultural differences. What are the implications? Well, one of them is you should actually be able to predict cultural differences by having people going through this WAVE procedure and measuring how much they like the colors that they know in that culture that are each of these colors. So we know, for example, that the WAVE in the USA predicts the preferences in the USA with a correlation of 0.9. We have partial data from Japan. And there seems to be a high positive correlation, not as high. But then the crucial thing is, what about these other correlations, the cross correlations? And in fact, the WAVEs in the US predict American preferences better than they predict Japanese preferences, and the wave in Japan predicts the Japanese preferences better than it predicts the American preferences. That's the pattern that you want to see if there's something to this, if it's accounting for some portion of the variance in the cultural data, and it does some. This is preliminary, but this is a general plan for how you can test this out. So you can do the same thing with looking for differences between males and females. We have differences between males and females. And the idea is that if you segregate, which we didn't do, we should have, but we didn't actually know this was going to work. You segregate the waves in terms of the men's waves versus the women's waves. There should be a higher correlation between the men's wave and their preferences than between the men's wave and women's preferences, and vice versa. So this is another thing that we're testing. And in fact, this is even true, should even be true for accounting for individual differences. So we're actually doing this right now in our own lab right here in Berkeley. The idea is that Mary's wave should predict Mary's preferences better than Sue's preferences, and Sue's wave should predict her preferences better than Mary's preferences. And we actually have, I think, about 14 subjects now, and it's true. You actually do get better predictions by looking at each individual's own affective valence estimates for both the standard objects that we gave for everybody, but we also now are asking them for their sort of idiosyncratic color-related objects, like grandma's sweater or the rocking chair in my dad's room when I was a kid, because they're the only people who are going to be making judgments about how much they like those things, and they can do that for themselves. So that's a very interesting way of going. So I'm kind of throwing you a lot of stuff here. I mean, what I've just told you, I don't know how interesting or useful that's going to be for people who do HCI. I mean, this is more of a scientific question. Why do people like the colors they do? In some sense, you're doing HCI. You want to know what colors people like. You don't really care why they like them, or maybe you don't really care whether they like them. Although we're currently doing an experiment where we're trying to manipulate people's color preferences by we're doing two sets of color preferences, and in between we give them another task which they think is related to our spatial composition project, in which we give half of the people get pictures that are selectively just good red stuff and bad green stuff, and another group just gets pictures of, what did I say, good red, bad red stuff and good green stuff. And so we're looking for an interaction in the second set of to see if things change. So essentially it's a kind of priming experiment. So we show you good red stuff, we show you strawberries and cherries and all of these things without showing you the blood and guts bad stuff. The idea is that this might prime your internal representation of these objects, and then that would then boost this, if you're doing this computation sort of online, as it were, when you're being asked how much do you like these colors, that it would be giving you a boost to the good red stuff, and that would then tend to make you like red more. We don't have data yet on that, but that's a prediction. Okay, what about color pairs? Also, I think this is of use to people in HCI, but I'm not one of those people, and so I'm going to sort of veer off in a different direction. But there's interesting information here for people who like who worry about that stuff. So we use these sort of figure ground displays with a little square on a big square, ask people how much they like that particular combination of colors. We ask them, how harmonious do you find this pair of colors? I'll come back to that. And how similar do you find this pair of colors? And of course, we've got, for each person, we've got how much they like each of the individual colors as an individual color because of this massive repeated measures design. The very same people gave us those data. We can actually look at that stuff. And that'll be sort of the end of the talk. So let's take a look and see what the data actually look like here. We're measuring now average preference ratings on this line mark rating scale for these color pairs. And I'm showing you one curve here, which is averaged over the cuts. How much do people like the combinations where the figure color is changing across the x-axis and the ground color is constant? This is the blue ground color, collapsed across cuts and so forth. And what you find is that people like the blue on blue combination better than any of the others. And in fact, it sort of falls off monotonically from there. Let's look at the rest of the data. That was just one cut, one particular background color. This is the full set of data. Again, it's been collapsed over hue, saturation and brightness levels. I just showed you that blue curve there. These are the rest of them. So there's a chartreuse curve. And again, you see the maximum is where it's chartreuse on chartreuse. People like that better than they like the other combinations. Now, if you look at sort of where, so just to line these data up, the peak is always at the same hue place. It's more peaked for some colors than it is for other colors. The flattened ones tend to be the warm colors. The highly peaked ones tend to be the cool colors. If you sort of line them up by this now plotting as a function of hue distance, where the 0 distance cases are the ones where the hue of the background and the figure are the same. They all have the same shape. They've just sort of been moved up and down and amplified a bit. So how do you explain these data? Well, one thing you might notice is that the position of these maxima on these functions here is, in fact, it's kind of like the wave. It's the cool, warm, cool wave, right? So maybe you can actually predict these data on the basis of how much people like the figural color and how much they like the ground color. Okay? And what happens if you do that? Well, not much. You don't do very well. These are the best predictions here on the right-hand side for the data on the left-hand side, when all you worry about is how much they like the warm color, how much they like the figural color, and how much they like the ground color. It doesn't do well because it's not a relational measure. To get this interaction with these peaks all happening at these different places, you're going to have some measure that's about the relationship between the two colors. And the thing that turns out to do the best is something called harmony. What is harmony? Actually, harmony is a pretty well-known concept in the art world. If you take any art classes, they'll talk about color harmony. They'll teach you about color harmony. What they'll teach you is sort of different from what I'm going to tell you, because by and large in art theory, the presumption is that everybody likes harmonious colors. And we find that that's not actually true. We think that harmony and preference, I mean, they could be true if you defined it that way, but we actually go to some pains to try to tell our subjects to not consider harmony and color and preference necessarily to be the same. And we do it by using a musical analogy. So we tell them the preference is how well you like a color pair, whereas harmony is how well the colors go together in some way. And people say, huh, what does that mean? Well, we say, well, it's like in music. Everybody might agree that Mozart's music is much more harmonious than Stravinsky's music. We play him a little bit of Mozart, we play him a little bit of Stravinsky. Nevertheless, there are some people who like Mozart, there are some people who like Stravinsky. So this analogy actually seems to help people a lot. It certainly breaks the tendency for people to want to say, well, if I like the colors, they must be harmonious. And we get very different ratings when we get the well, they're related to each other because people do like harmonious color combinations. But let me show you what the data look like first. So these are the preference data that we got, how much people like color pairs. And these are the harmony ratings. This is actually the best predictions of a linear model that includes people's harmony ratings and their ratings for how much they like the figural color and how much they like the ground color. So all three of these things matter. Just to go back to what I said at the beginning, if you want to do custom websites for people where you want the colors that you're using to be pleasing to people, you have to worry about how much they like individual colors and how much do they like harmonious colors. I'll get back to that. And then you can do actually a pretty good job. If you look at our harmony ratings relative to what the color theorists in art say, the color theorists in art would predict something like this. Of course, they don't draw graphs. But they do talk in language about there being harmonies of analogous colors, which I take to mean that people should think harmonious colors are similar to each other in hue. And they also talk about harmonies of contrastive colors. And this is the idea that red and green are a harmonious combination and blue and yellow are a harmonious combination. No, not true. You look at our data, there's none of that, except there's a little bit of evidence for blue and yellow. And again, I think that's a Berkeley effect. Ha ha ha, you'd laugh. I'm sure it's a Berkeley effect. But in any case, so why do the color theorists think that red and green are harmonious combinations? And why do they think that blue and yellow are harmonious combinations? Well, I think it's partly because they conflated harmony with preference. And I think there is something about these highly contrastive hues that makes people find colors to be more preferable. But it's not in the combination. It's that the color itself looks better against the background that's highly contrastive. So I'm going to show you some data. Oh, this isn't data. These are some contrastive colors that a guy named Van Gogh used to good effect. But I'm going to show you some data from another test that we did in this big experiment where people saw displays like this where the entire background was light orange or say light blue, and they saw all of the colors and they had to rate all of the colors against them, and they're very explicitly instructed to be rating how much they like the color of the little squares, not how much they like the combination. Okay? So what do you find? Well, we've got a warm background here, and we've got a cool background. Now look at the ratings that they've given to the warm colors against the warm background versus the warm colors against the cool background. Well, in every single case, they like the warm colors better against the cool background. And when you look at the ratings that they gave for the cool figures, in every case they like the cool figures against the warm backgrounds better. Where they're rating the color, they're not rating the combinations of the colors. And I actually, for some reason, don't have the slide with me, but if you look at the plots of these data, they look like sort of our individual color ratings, and not like the harmony ratings or the preference for color. So I believe that they're telling us just how much they like the colors themselves. These are called simultaneous color contrast effects, and that the color looks more vivid and saturated when it's against a contrastive background. So I think that there's a sense in which the color theorists were right. They just had their explanation wrong. It's not that contrastive colors are harmonious. They're not. If anything, they're sort of almost more clashing or more disharmonious than almost any others you can think of. But they have this side effect, which is that they tend to make colors that are highly contrastive look better when they're against that background. This is just to show you that you actually get these neat, reversals here. So with blue, you like blue better than yellow against this orange background, and against the blue background, you like the yellow better than the blue. Harmony ratings, I've shown you the harmony data. They look like this. What about similarity? I mean, maybe it's just a matter of similarity. Well, if you look at the hue data, what you find is that hue similarity, they do look alike, except that these data are just amplified. And that's because the individual differences here are very slight. Individual differences here are bigger, and individual differences in the preferences for the pairs are bigger still. Okay? But there's also a difference between harmony and similarity in the brightness and saturation domain. So just to take an example here of yellow and blue, if you look at which are the highest similarity ratings, they're the one along the major diagonal here, light against light, medium against the medium, and dark against dark. But if you look at the harmony ratings, they're greater along this axis here. And in fact, whereas you can predict, say, I can't remember exactly, say 75% of the variance using the harmony ratings, you can actually only predict about less than 50% of the variance if you use similarity ratings. So it really is harmony, not similarity, that's doing the work. Okay? Oh, there it is. Actually, the harmony, that's just predicting from harmony and just predicting from similarity. It's twice as good, in effect. Okay, so what about this business of aesthetic personality? Well, we're interested in this idea of what we're going to call preference for harmony. Because we find not only individual differences in terms of what colors people like, we find individual differences which I think are relatively systematic in terms of how much people like harmony. Some people, my mother, for example, loved harmony. I mean, the living room I grew up in was like beige on beige with accents of brown, and cream color and stuff like that. It was all very, very much a single hue there. And other people don't particularly like that at all. They like things that are much more disharmonious. So we looked at these correlations, which are, they really pretty much go from 0 to +1. There doesn't seem to be anybody who systematically dislikes harmonious colors. But there's some people for whom it's pretty much indifferent, and there are other people who like it a lot. We looked at the personality data to see if there were some factors in personality that could explain this. And no, there isn't. At first we thought there was an extroversion, introversion thing, that the people who like harmonious colors tend to be more introverted, but it doesn't even reach statistical significance. These are correlations. There's a correlation of less than 0.2, so it's accounting for like 3% of the variance. Not impressive. But that doesn't mean that there aren't systematic things about it. We're currently working on the idea that there is something that I'm going to call aesthetic personality, which is like preference for internal coherence or preference for structure or something like that. And the idea is that the people who like the harmonious colors are also going to be people who are going to like symmetrical shapes. They're going to be people who like, in my spatial composition project, we have this task where we give people a rectangle and we ask them to rate how well a dot fits in various positions within the rectangle. And that the same people are going to like things that have strong internal structure in these different domains. So I'm going to tell you about a pilot study that we've done on that. So I've just told you about color composition, this notion of color harmony and how well harmony correlates with people's preferences. In patterns or shapes, we've got notions of figural goodness or simplicity that come from the Gestalt psychologists. And that's not the same thing necessarily as preference. Some people may like simple good figures, and other people may like complicated figures. The spatial composition there, the notion we call it goodness of fit. Some people like the dot when it fits well within the frame, like right in the center of it. Other people wouldn't have it there for the world. And there's also musical compositions, that is to say, like the analogy that I gave people. There's Mozart and there's Stravinsky, and some people may like Mozart better. The basic idea is that the people who like the harmonious color combinations will tend to be the same people who like symmetrical, simple figures. They'll like the dot to be in the center or along the symmetry axes of the frame, and the people who like the more harmonious kind of music. Music, as you get further away from the domain, it becomes less clear that it's actually going to happen. So we're looking at this, and I'm going to tell you about this pilot study, I think, with 20 people. Okay, this is a small sample for something across where you're looking at individual differences, but it's very promising. So we did the color composition. I told you sort of about how we measure that sort of thing. We look at how well people like the colors that are same hued versus different hued, and it turns out that the things that are judged lowest on harmony again are the ones that have reds in them. I said there's something special about reds. Actually, all of the four least harmonious color combinations are ones that involve red, particularly in the background. Spatial composition, we had people rating the dots within the position of a dot within a frame. And so some people, we have both ratings of how much they like this particular composition and how simple how well the dot fits within it. And for the pattern shape, in this case, we use these little dot patterns that were symmetrical or asymmetrical. Gee, I didn't know I was... Oh, okay, we can go through this. I just told you all this. And this is just a little bit more background again, each of these tasks. So when we did the dots within the rectangles, this is a piece of that other, remember I told you I had another project was about spatial composition? Well, this is one little piece of that project. So this individual difference thing is in some sense an arch that kind of relates these two things. The size of these dots here shows how high the ratings are of fit for a dot at that position within the rectangle. So the center is the best. There's the global axes of symmetry along the vertical and horizontal axes. And then there's also a sort of little ridge of symmetry along the local, a ridge of good fit along the angle bisectors, which are the local axes of symmetry near the corners. That's quite robust, and we get it all the time. And then the other one, we have people rate these dot patterns, which have these different symmetry structures in terms of how simple and regular they are, and then how much do you like them. And we get correlations there as well. Now, the question is this preference for internal coherence. Okay, for each of these domains, we've got a correlation between preference and this internal coherence measure, which is color harmony or goodness of fit or figural simplicity. Okay, we're looking now at the correlations between correlations. Okay, so to what degree is there a correlation across subjects in terms of how much they like the good fitting, the internally coherent, the well-structured stuff? Does that make sense? Okay. And so what do we find with these 20 subjects? Well, between color and spatial composition, a correlation of 0.47, which is pretty good, because there's a lot more noise than when you're doing these higher order correlations. Color in the dot pattern shape, 0.79, 0.71, and 0.5. So this is very encouraging. And we're doing now this experiment in a better, more full-fledged fashion, but also including doing the stuff from with music. I want to leave some time for questions. So, what we're doing right now is, in fact, another of these MR, massive repeated measure designs, looking at this sort of individual different stuff, which includes getting the waves from individuals and trying to predict their own individual color preferences, as well as these stylistic differences, aesthetic style differences, including the musical composition stuff. So, just to give you a range from the simple to the not so harmonious. So this is our most simple and harmonious piece. These are all piano pieces. Okay. To Schoenberg. Big difference there. Now, I tend to believe that. I don't know if we've ever had anybody who's like that best. But we want to bracket it. I mean, there may be some people who like the Schumann best, but most people are somewhere kind of in between. And so we're getting a large number of people to do a large number of these tasks again, trying to get this sort of triangulation to work for us for individual differences. So what have I done? I've talked about massive repeated measures designs and why they're useful for a domain in which there's big individual differences. It's not something that cognitive scientists do very much, especially vision scientists. I talked about color preferences for individual colors and the fact that they're sort of systematic. I've talked about gender expertise and cultural differences. And I've talked about the ecological valence theory as a very different way of explaining why we like the colors that we do, and then how that might be related to, how that might explain gender and cultural effects. I've talked about preferences for color pairs and the fact that they're driven primarily by harmony, and the possibility that there might be individual differences among people that would be relatively stable across domains. Now, this might be important for you want to do stuff with website design where you want to pick not only good colors but a good layout and so forth and so on. You may not have to do it separately for each of those domains. You may be able just to do the color stuff and find out whether there's somebody who likes harmonious colors, and if they do, you're going to want to put things in the center and you want things to be symmetrically related to each other, whereas if they pick the less harmonious colors, you may want them to be off-axis and more edgy in terms of the kinds of spatial layout that you use. So I think that this is very fertile ground, that more people should be doing this, and I'm looking for collaborators if anybody wants to join in. I want to thank all the people who've worked on this project with me, of which there are many. NSF and Google now have sponsored us, but our actual main sponsor in the stuff that I've told you about color was Amy's Natural and Organic Foods. My collaborators who worked on this, Karen Schloss, her uncle works for Amy's, and he gave us lots of free coupons with which we paid our subjects. We would not have been able to do this without Amy's. NSF doesn't fund you, and basically unless you sort of already got the data. So that's how we managed to get the data, and once we had that data, then NSF decided we were worth supporting. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions.
So I'm completely persuaded now that we can have a science of aesthetics, and that it's an important thing if we did. And I'm persuaded that color is a really good place to start. I'm less persuaded that light is the right question to ask. And so by that I mean that it seems a little bit facile to try and measure aesthetic utility in the abstract. It seems like aesthetic utility is not purely it's certainly, I don't believe it to be a universal truth or even a personal truth, but rather a situational truth. So for the Sex Pistols album cover, where they're trying to be as cranky as possible, pinky pink and lime green with dissonant design is perfect. Whereas if you wanted to make an album cover for that sort of musical piece you play there, then harmonious would be perfect.
Right, and actually, if I were giving this talk about spatial composition, by this point I would have already said exactly that. I mean, we do try to look at, to some degree, at issues like this with the different, how much do you like these colors for different objects? And we were actually surprised at the extent to which we found that the hues were relatively invariant, hue preferences were relatively invariant there. But I certainly agree with you that we have this notion that we call in the spatial composition project that we call representational fit. And the idea is that the things that people will like most are in fact the things in which the spatial characteristics of the picture fit the message that you're trying to convey, is where we eventually get to. And the way that we get there is by looking at differences that occur when you give the same compositions different titles. So in one case, you have the same picture of the guy walking, and we've done stuff where he's in different horizontal positions. And typically, if he's walking and facing in a direction, you like him to be facing into the frame rather than out of the frame, not right in the center, but a bit to the side where they're facing in. But you can change how much people like that by having different titles to it. So if the title is starting out, then you like it better if he's to the side, going much to the inside of the frame. And if it's Journey's End, then you want him to be essentially walking out of the frame with the empty space behind him. So that's working on a spatial metaphor that time is in front of you and so forth and so on. So you can see where we are with that. We haven't used that with this. I agree that's a perfect example if you want it, depending on what your use is. And this is the kind of thing, of course, that color and graphic designers and consultants of all persuasions hopefully know already. But we lag, in sort of the scientific community lags way behind practice. Just look at, shape from shading when it was discovered. Leonardo and before, and when we finally got a grip on shape from shading in a scientific sense. Well, I don't know how many hundred years it was, but at least 500. Yeah.
So this is really fascinating data. I'm just curious about what variable you didn't seem to pursue beyond which is age. So there's grandmother aesthetics and teenage aesthetics.
Yeah.
At least in the popular sense, they would seem to correlate a lot with what you're doing.
Yeah. Well, that's another thing that we could do. There's a lot of things that we haven't done that we could do. Tracking individuals over time. We talked at the lunch about seasonal variations might be there. These are all things we'd love to do. In adolescence, I just saw a paper that some other people did looking at age differences in England versus, I think it was China, and showing that in adolescence, there's this huge separation that takes place in terms of how much boys versus girls like pinks. And that doesn't appear when they're little kids, and it doesn't appear when they're adults, or at least not nearly so plausibly. So I think there are a lot of things that are like that. And there's fashions, and to what degree, grandma's sense of color is in fact, rooted in maybe the 70s when she actually redecorated her house or something like that. I don't know. But there are going to be all these kinds of changes, and I didn't mention this in this particular talk for strategic reasons, but we expect, and we are actually measuring a number of different kinds of social factors that influence people's color preferences. So, I mean, this is not something that we're studying just because we don't want to bring them into the lab, but gangs. I mean, if you're a blood and you like red, then you like red, and you don't like blue, I guess it is. If you're a Crip, you like blue and not red. And I believe that those are real preferences, and they're not things that people were born with. It's not like you became a blood because you liked red. Any more than it's like, you could decide to come to Stanford because you like red, or to Berkeley because you like blue and yellow. So we're looking at some of those kinds of things too. I'll tell you, I just have to tell you this because it's so interesting. And when I first heard it, I'm going to preface this by saying that this research project has had a transformative effect on my perspective. I wish Don Norman were here. He was my mentor. I got my PhD with Don and Dave. And I came into the project with this kind of like sort of biological, psychophysical kind of thing. I really wanted it to be neat and tidy with respect to some color space. But one of the things that this has done, that once I came up with the idea for the theory, it's just kind of, whoa, the stuff that I thought was noise is all of a sudden signal. It's stuff that's potentially explainable. You just have to be clever and figure out ways of testing those kinds of things. So here's an interesting fact. You would think from the ecological valence theory, just on the sort of biological argument, that people would always like blue. And that seems to be true from what I know cross-culturally in the modern days. Basically, the cultures that I know about all seem to have a broad peak around blue. But when you go back and look at ancient Rome, blue was the least favorite color. How could that possibly be? There's this wonderful book that I recommend. It was written by an historian, Michael, began with a P. It's called Blue, The History of a Color. And in ancient Rome, blue was the least favorite, lowest status color. It was used to mark the people who were insane, for example. And they claim, I don't know the details of it, but they claim that in ancient Rome they would even sometimes leave blue out of the rainbow. And some people even wondered, well, maybe they had something different about their visual system, they couldn't see blue. It's really kind of comical. But I think the real explanation is that Rome's enemies to the north were the Celts. And the Celts loved blue. And in fact, they painted their faces and bodies with blue when they went into battle with the Romans. And they also had enemies to the east where blue was their favorite color. So here's a situation where the Romans hate the Celts and these other guys, and both of their favorite colors is blue, so the Romans hate blue, right? So that's a beautiful example of this sort of social effect in terms of people's color preferences, at least as exhibited in public displays. That doesn't mean that some people didn't actually like blue but wouldn't say so or something like that, but it doesn't appear in the artifacts and of ancient Rome to a degree that would be inexplicable just based on a sort of biological story. So there's really are social, cultural, and individual components to this which have made me a psychologist again. I talk to my colleagues who do emotion research and developmental research and all kinds of stuff that I didn't do before because it's opened me up to the interesting possibilities here. In the back there.
When you mentioned what you're going to do with music, it shows like when you mention what you're trying to do with music now, you show us like a little piece of music, like 3 or 4 compasses. But when you do that with color, you don't do images, even like simple images, but just the color. Why the difference? Why you don't get a note when you do music and you do get a
Good question. I don't know whether I know the answer off the top of my head. I mean, partly it's because I think I can do it. that people do have these responses. They do have aesthetic responses to just little swatches of color. They don't have particularly strong aesthetic responses to individual notes. And in fact, people have done research in the past trying to look for cross-modal links between vision and audition for musical stuff at the level of individual notes, and they really don't find anything very interesting. When we do it with pieces of music, the overall, it's like these are 60-second pieces, but 10 seconds of it would probably do. We find huge effects, very systematic. And if you look at the relationship between people's emotional reaction to the music in terms of how happy versus sad it is, and how strong versus weak it is, and how happy versus sad and how strong versus weak the colors are that they pick to go with the music, the correlation between those two is 0.97. It's staggering. I've never seen a number like that in my life, in all the 35 or more, 40 years I've been doing research. So there's a really strong signal there. It doesn't arise in the individual notes. So it might be that it would be, the same thing would be true in color. I think there's a stronger signal from just individual colors or pairs of colors. And if we used, Van Goghs and, much larger context like that, the signal clearly is stronger. The problem is there's so many other variables that are involved in those things. I think we could probably move up to doing Mondrian type things, which are just sort of pastiches of rectangles laid on top of each other with a few colors, and we're going to start doing that relatively soon. So we'll find out how different things get.
Okay, we are actually past the time. So
Oh,
thank
that's
you.
right.
And if you want to come up and ask questions later,
Thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.